So time to finish up this TopHat Club Royale. I called Brian at TopHat the other day, expecting it to be about a 5-minute phone call just to ask him a few questions about how this amp originally would have been built. We ended up talking for about an hour and a half about this amp and amps in general and lots of stuff we've run into and where we agree and where we politely disagree on some subtleties, but it was a very nice experience, and I always like making new connections with other amp fiends like myself. Let me show you a few things I need to take care of before we even dive in to the filter caps here. So upon removing the chassis from the cabinet so I could have better access for the caps, I noticed two things. First of all, the screw that holds the chassis to the cabinet was apparently loose at some point, and so there was a little bit of wiggle room, and the metal on the chassis kind of puckered up. You can see it underneath the faceplate there a little bit, and the washer there is all concave now. It's a pretty thick steel washer, so this was a lot of force. I imagine that what happened was the screw was a little bit loose, and the amp was dropped, plus just the weight of the chassis over the years. So I don't know whether the owner's going to want me to really fix this, which would require taking everything off the front panel, including the faceplate, and then pressing that metal flush, doubling up on some washers to reinforce that area, then putting it all back together. That's minorly structural. Once the screw's tight, it'll be tight, it'll be fine, but I would want that done if it were my amp, but that is probably an additional hour plus of labor. So that's up to the owner. He can watch this video, call me, we'll talk about it. The next thing I noticed, though, we have to take care of pronto. Through the weight and probably multiple droppings of this amp over the years, the flanges here have become deformed that hold this large Vox-style choke in place. So I'm going to remove these screws very carefully because they're sheet metal screws and there are only so many times you can take them out and put them back. And given where they are, with this one being underneath where the filter caps are mounted, I really don't want to have to drill these out and replace them with machine screws, though it's still possible. Just trying to minimize the hassle. So once I get these screws out, I'm going to very carefully put pressure on those flanges to flatten them out to get that choke mounted firmly against the chassis so it won't continue to deform, because over time these can actually tear. The metal is not that thick. But once I get them flattened out and I reinforce those with some steel washers, that should probably prevent that from happening again. Well, it's not perfect, but it's an awful lot better. I was able to get a lot of the concavity out and a lot of the extreme bend out and got these much more closer to flat, at least in the middle. It's really hard to deal with bent metal like this, because the more you bend metal, the weaker it gets at the seam. And that's in fact how if I wanted to break this off, I'd just bend it back and forth a few times and it would break off. So there's a limit to what you can do. And with such a small surface area, I couldn't use any of my larger clamps, but I was able to get it to the point where I knew that if I reinforced these screw heads with some wider, thick washers, stainless steel, this would be a much more robust connection going forward. So going forward is the plan. So this is another time where, due to the kind of cramped confines of the chassis, I may not be able to show you everything that I'm doing as I'm doing it, just because the camera wants to be where I need to be. So let me show you what I can and explain anything that happens in between. So this positive's already been disconnected. I'm going to disconnect these positives. I'm going to leave those positive leads with their insulation going to where they go so I can reconnect everything. And down here, I can't tell if this is stock. This cap's negative and this cap's negative are just twisted onto this cap's negative, and that is going to this ground lug held in place by transformer bolt, which is not something I'm a huge fan of usually in fenders, especially when it's just one cap's nut holding things in place. This has got the other three caps nuts reinforced by some big steel washers, almost to the size of a fender washer. So I think those are going to be, as long as those are solid, they're going to be bearing an awful lot of the weight. I don't see any deformation of the chassis here. I imagine if this is kept really tight and clean, this will be fine. I'm just not sure that a single one here is going to be sufficient to really do these caps properly. So I may add another ground lug there. We shall see. But to begin, we shall just snip and gently pull these three out because there's a little bit of silicone holding them to the felt. Okay, well, I'll work that out without destroying that felt in just a minute. I can't get in there right now with the camera here. I'm going to do the same thing to the two positives at the other side, and I'll catch you all in just a minute. As you can see, some of the carbon film resistors, which were non-original to the amp, have been replaced with carbon composites, per Brian's request. Easily done. New electrolytics, sprigs where possible, like he used originally. So there, and the full bypass, the boost mode, and here on this cathode. And 22 down here, that's for the second tube, is on V2. It's very similar to a Vox in a lot of ways. And then 10 microfarad, the 10 microfarad for the first preamp stage. These were 1818 as the amp came into me. 18 microfarad sprigs are no longer made. The difference between an 18 microfarad and a 22 microfarad is negligible. Brian agreed, and I've had really good luck with these FNTs versus current production sprig atoms. So 22 and 10, which is his preferred value over the 1818, and little dabs of silicone here, primarily to keep these polystyrenes from getting microphonic. But he had done that same thing throughout the rest of the amp, so it's just kind of messy tribute to his work, not to the levels of a car, but there it is. And there's silicone beneath this stack of caps and the felt, and there's silicone between the two caps, and then this zip tie joining them together as well. This is very rigid, clear insulation on the positives like he used. He'd had clear insulation on the negatives, but there's nothing there that could get grounded out, so I didn't do that there. This is just negative to negative here. And then that microphonic lead from the input jack to the grid of this tube has been replaced, and you can see that's that same stuff I use all the time, which is Teflon coated silver stranded goodness, PTFE 22 gauge, very nice shielded wire. Everything terminated neatly. All the jacks have been tightened, all the tube sockets have been cleaned, all the pots have been cleaned inside and out. Let's move on down to this end of things, down here. And down at this end, you can see the new cathode bypass cap here, mounted above the 5-watt resistor beneath it. So if that resistor gets hot, this cap does not bake. I have verified the bias is good and safe with EL84s with modern wall voltage. As I mentioned, this had 33 microfarad 1818 as it came in. 18s are not available anymore, so 30, 22, 22. No one would hear any difference between this. Positive leads have the clear insulation. There's silicone beneath each capacitor and between each one, in keeping with the rest of the amp and the original build. Now, crucially, in my opinion, down here, rather than having one negative lead going to the grounding hardware and the other negative leads going to that one cap's negative lead, that's just a lot of stress to put on one lead on one of these capacitors. So I was able to get these two negative leads to this ground lug here, and there's another ground lug here, I'm not sure if you can see it, connected to the same bolt, that this third cap, its negative lead is going to that. So each one has its own individual mechanical connection before soldering. And I took all this ground apart and cleaned all the surfaces and put everything back together. And I know that this is very reliable going forward. I have played the amp. It is wonderful sounding. It has a very low noise floor now. I don't think that any of the problems the amp had been experiencing will come back. Between the recap Everything cleaned out, some iffy solder joints cleaned up. Oh yeah, I changed out this cap that was that badly installed Mallory 150. I put a Vishay MKT 1813, which is one of my preferred capacitors. I could have gotten a WMF like the rest of these in here, but that would have been a $5 cap and $9 shipping just for one capacitor. I already had these. No need to charge the guy $15 when you won't hear a difference. But the mechanical connections are now good, and the old leads are out of these terminals, unlike the previous work where it was just all kind of kludged and yucky. I have verified the bias is good, as I said, I believe, and you'll get to hear it maybe tomorrow. I'll do a playing test. I think I'll show this, and I'll show the car, because they're comparable in the marketplace in a lot of ways. I'm not going to put it back in its cabinet yet until I hear from the owner on whether he wants me to go forward, in case he wants me to go a little bit farther, rather, and repair this mechanical damage, which is not really necessary, but the thing is just so nice. It'd be nice to get this as perfect as possible, in my opinion, but I'm not here to spend people's money for them.